Hello, everyone. Welcome. So glad to see you all here. I know there's something beautiful and sunny happening outside. I think we have something terrific on offer here as well. We're glad to have you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Adam Zucker. I'm a professor in the English department here at UMass, and I am one of the co-editors of the journal ELR, which is the host of today's Collins Lecture. The Collins Lecture is a yearly event. It is made possible in part by generosity of the Kinney Center for Interdisciplinary Renaissance Studies, the English Department, the College of Humanities and Fine Arts, but mostly by virtue of a very generous donation by Dan S. and Polly Collins. Dan was one of the founding members of ELR, an editorial board member for many, many years. And it's he and his wife, who was a bibliographer and a librarian, basically donated a chunk of money many years ago. And it's because of that generosity that every year we're able to be together and hear from a visiting eminent scholar. I want to make sure I've said everything I'd like to say about that. Oh yes, there are people joining us on a YouTube live stream. Hello. There will be a question and answer session afterwards, and I will have my laptop open, reading questions that come into the question box on YouTube. It's called the question box, I believe. And so you rest assured you'll be part of the event as well. It's my job to thank you all for coming and also to turn the stage over to the director for the Kinney Center of Interdisciplinary Renaissance Studies, who will introduce our speaker, and that person is Professor Marjorie Rubright.
Reflecting on the state of Renaissance studies and her contribution to the 25th anniversary publication of English Literary Renaissance, Professor Melissa Sanchez posed a question to the field. Is Renaissance studies woke? When beginning to notice and care about injustices in the present, she writes, when we become, in current parlance, woke, we also begin to notice and care about aspects of the past that we may not have seen before, even if they were right under our noses all along. How, she asks, has the current moment in which we live conditioned not only what we see in Renaissance literature, but also what this literature may allow us to see differently about our own deeply disordered world? To be sure, the questions Professor Sanchez has asked over the course of her distinguished career and the new lines of inquiry that her intersectional methodologies have opened have fundamentally transformed the state of Renaissance studies, revealing time and again how Renaissance studies offers a valuable theoretical and historical vantage point from which to consider mutually informing categories of race, empire, gender, sexuality, and ability. Melissa Sanchez, who I have the honor of introducing today, is the Donald T. Regan Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Pennsylvania, where she directs the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies, and Penn's program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. Her critical work spans broadly across early modern literature, poetry and poetics, comparative race and empire studies, gender and sexuality studies, feminist and queer theory, psychoanalytic studies, and the emerging field of early modern trans studies. She brings all this to bear in her celebrated pedagogy. Melissa has won numerous teaching awards from Penn's School of Arts and Sciences. She was awarded, and you'll have to tell me more about this, the most valuable professor from Penn's women's basketball team in 2019. And in 2021, the Christian R. and Mary F. Lindbach Award for Distinguished Teaching by the Provost's Office. Always one step behind the basketball team. She is the author of 3 books, Queer Faith, Reading Promiscuity and Race in the Secular Love Tradition, which reassesses key texts of the which reassesses key texts of the prehistory of modern monogamy to show that writing assumed to promote fidelity, in fact, articulates the perversity of desire and the elusiveness of self-knowledge. In Shakespeare and Queer Theory, Melissa introduces students and scholars to the field of queer theory, Shakespeare studies, and the interchanges between them. And in Erotic Subjects, the Sexuality of Politics in Early Modern English Literature, she examines how 16th and 17th century writers used scenarios of erotic violence and cross-gender identification to explore the origins and limits of political allegiance. In addition, she's edited 3 volumes of essays. And if many of you in the room have been to conferences of all kinds, and one thing that you will notice in our field of early modern studies is that somehow Melissa Sanchez is always there. And this array of the collections that she has done in collaboration with others really shows you, I think, the expanse of her creativity and her capacity for engagement with big ideas and many people along the way. With Aisha Ramachandran, she co-edited a special issue of Spencer's Studies on Spencer and the Human in 2016. With Anya Lumba, she co-edited Rethinking Feminism in Early Modern Studies, Gender, Race, and Sexuality, an invaluable volume of essays on the current state of feminist studies in the early modern period. Don't teach without it, which received the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women's Award for Best Collaborative Project in 2016. And with Ari Friedlander and Will Stockton, she co-edited a special issue of the Journal of Early Modern Cultural Studies entitled Desiring History and Historicizing Desire, a collection of essays discussing the relations between queer and historicist methods of reading. She's currently editing the Routledge Companion to Queer Literary Studies and co-editing All the World in Thee, a historical book of queer poems under contract with Columbia University Press. She's completing 2 books. The first poses yet another question for our field. Its title is, What Were Women Writers? And the second is entitled, Assuming Guilt. Melissa's Collins lecture today is Early Modern Erotica and the Pleasures of Paranoid Reading. Please join me in extending an enthusiastic welcome to Melissa Sanchez.
Thank you, Marjorie, for that incredibly generous and humbling introduction. I'll just begin by thanking the ELR editorial board and the Alfred Kinney Center for inviting me here and hosting me. And special thanks go out to Adam Zucker, Jane Wang Gegenhardt, and of course Marjorie Rubright for your for hosting me. To Liz Fox for so meticulously arranging the visit, and to Matthew Walsh for taking me around and making sure I've gotten everywhere I need to be on time, which I tend not to be able to do on my own. And more generally, thanks to everyone who has taken the time to eat with me, talk with me, drink with me, and just generally make this the most pleasant visit I could imagine. So as Marjorie said, my talk tonight is entitled The Pleasures of Paranoia in Early Modern English Erotica. Considered by early critics to be tawdry and simplistic soft porn for women, erotic fiction was long seen as the embarrassing other to the novel's social and psychological realism. In recent decades, however, feminist and historicist critics have demonstrated that this writing, in fact, offers a complex analysis of gendered and political relations in the 17th century. Building on this work, I read 17th century erotica as a valuable archive for understanding histories of affect and sexuality, particularly as these histories have shaped recent debates about methods of reading. Formally and structurally, this genre complicates modern methodological categories that pit surface against symptom, affect against context, and reparative against paranoid reading, and that align the former set of terms with gentle and generous love, the latter with aggressive and greedy violation. Part of the fun of early modern erotica is that it teases readers with conspicuously partial accounts of passions and motives that are opaque and overdetermined. In undercutting its own descriptions of innocence and virtue, erotic fiction eschews early distinctions between morality and immorality, sincere love and treacherous self-interest, a difference that St. Augustine explained thus: to enjoy, frui, something is to hold fast to it in love for its own sake. To use, uti, something is to apply whatever it may be to the purpose of obtaining what you love, indeed, if that is something that ought to be loved. The ever-present possibility that fruitio may turn out to be utilitas, or vice versa, extends to readers' relationships with texts. How can a reader, then or now, tell whether they are enjoying texts for their own sake or instrumentalizing them for other ends, whether those ends are pornographic arousal or professional advancement? The answer, more often than not, is both. For early modern erotica reveals the discrete categories of pleasurable love and calculated use, along with the cognates that both conventional morality and post-critical polemics assume, are themselves mutually constitutive, historically produced, and structured by gendered and racialized hierarchies. I focus on three popular mid and late 17th century prose works tonight, which differ strikingly from both the Renaissance romance's idealization of self-sacrificial love that preceded them and the 18th century novel's idealization of middle-class respectability that followed. These are George Thornley's 1657 translation of Longus's 2nd century AD pastoral romance, Daphnis and Chloe, Roger Lestrange's 1678 translation of the Lettres Portugaises, and Afferben's Love Letters Between a Nobleman and His Sister. She's not actually his sister, published in 3 parts between 1684 and 1687. In these erotic fictions, characters, narrator, and reader alike are unable to distinguish definitively between innocence and knowledge, sincerity and unconstancy, love and interest. Insofar as these works stress the difficulty of interpreting the truth of what anyone wants, they also provide an important resource for thinking through methodological debates about reading itself. As a genre, 17th century erotic fiction puts its readers on notice that characters and narrators' words and actions can rarely be taken at face value, and so encourages readers, in Frederick Jameson's words, to seek a latent meaning behind a manifest one. At the same time, early modern erotica emphasizes that the surface is all we have. We have no more access to interior truth or depths of characters than narrators or the characters themselves do, or can, given that these characters and narrators' very material existence is itself an illusion that we as readers help to fabricate. The unwieldy historical and linguistic origins of English erotic prose as translation and as topical allegory further complicate any straightforward distinction between a text surface and its meaning. The self-conscious play between contents and context, ignorance and knowledge in erotic prose teases us with a depth that we cannot access, even as it undermines the fiction of self-transparency on which many distinctions between paranoia and repair depend. Section 1, Suspicious Minds, or the epistemology of pastoral erotics in Daphnis and Chloe. Longus's Daphnis and Chloe is the story of 2 young lovers who crave sex but don't know how to have it. Want of skill, not conventional morality, is all that stands in their way. George Thornley prefaces his translation with an epistle to young beauties that asks us to doubt Longus's central conceit, which is the comic and titillating naivete of the title characters. For Thornley, childlike innocence is a cover for sophisticated voyeurism, pastoral a covert form of pornography, in that both turn on what Michael McKeon has described as the oscillation between concealment and revelation that registers the fundamental disparity between the will towards sexual activity and the unwillingness or inability to acknowledge it. Echoing a long-standing trope of advertising romances as offering men the voyeuristic pleasure of reading works that aroused women's readers, Thornley advertises his translation of this Greek tale as, I'll let you see the title page, as a most sweet and pleasant pastoral romance for young ladies. Thornley's prefatory epistle establishes a model of reading that equates his own disingenuous denials of lascivious intent with the romance's claim of its character's innocence. Thornley opens this epistle by stating, and this is that first highlighted bit, "This little pleasant lawnship of love, by its own destiny and mine, belongs most properly to your fair eyes and hands and happier laps." And then, who would not lay his leg over a book, although that sometimes has been the complaint of a scholar's solitude? Having suggested the autoerotic uses of this book, Thornley immediately denies that he has any such thing in mind. But hold, there's nothing to that purpose, but what Lacanium taught her scholar in the wood. Except for this one little scene of erotic initiation, a trope that James Grantham Turner has seen as paradigmatic of early modern pornography, this tale offers no explicit descriptions of sex. In short, Thornley maintains, nothing to vex you, unless perchance in your own conscience. Yet Thornley then immediately undermines this romance disclaimer by alleging that those who miss the sexual content of Daphnis and Chloe only pretend to do so. The naivete of its title characters is analogous to that feigned by Thornley's female readership. And this is that second quote. Chloe knew well enough, though the author makes her simple, what and where her fancy was. And Daphnis, too, needed not Lacanium's lantern to aplac it, or to follow Will with the wisps. But hark you, lady, and I will tell you a story, one I had at a tavern vesper. A boy and a girl were got thither together. The boy opened his shop and drew out all a young beginner had to show. The girl asked him, what was that? The boy said it was his purse. The girl looked upon herself. And if that be thy purse, then, quoth she, my purse is curt. And these are parallels to the simple rurals here, that is, in Longus. But besides, it is so like your own either simplicity or art that you cannot but approve it here. You do not know what we mean when we speak as plain as day. And now you have an author too, which you never had before, to prove you do not counterfeit. The language of the epistle likens the jokes told at a tavern vesper to the simple rurals of the tale to follow. Thornley's epistle models not just what Daphnis and Chloe does, but also what readers do with it. Like Chloe, who knew well enough what and where her fancy was, women cover their erotic desire with simplicity. You do not know what we mean when we speak as plain as day. Thornley accuses women of performing the opposite of paranoia, insofar as they attribute innocent meaning to men's illicit or even predatory expressions of desire. But this feigned innocence itself responds to language whose meaning is not, in fact, plain as day. Chloe's fancy is at once her imagination in the obvious sense, but fancy is also Thornley's term for vagina throughout his translation. And even this assertion of Chloe's clinical knowledge of her body, of course she knew what and where her vagina was, relies on a double understanding of fancy as both material locus of penetration and synecdoche for arousal. Thornley's own framing speaks at least as much, possibly more, to the male readers he does not address as to the young ladies to whom he does. In this epistolary scaffolding, men's suspicion of women's professions of sexual naivete is essential to the pleasure of reading Daphnis and Chloe on two levels. Men like Thornley enjoy the content of the text itself, and that enjoyment is enhanced by a framing that positions men as voyeurs of women readers' private arousal. This pleasure relies on and sustains gendered hierarchies that render women's sexual desires and practices objects of male surveillance and discipline. Read through the lens of Thornley's epistle, Daphnis and Chloe is less a straight story of innocence than a queer meditation on the affect of reading itself. And insofar as that affect is implicated in power relations, it cannot function in a purely reparative fashion. As Simon Goldhill argues, the history of translation and commentary on Longus testifies to the difficult question of how far to go in reading. If the fiction of innocence, and this is still Goldhill, establishes the question of the whence of desire, the erotic narrative establishes a question of the reader's fiction of mastery, of control, and self-control. Or, Goldhill adds, to read a double entendre with Sophrosne is to miss the joke. Sophrosne, and I'm probably butchering that word, which is the Greek term for discretion or self-mastery, refuses the effective and erotic force of double entendre by sticking with the text surface as opposed to reading too much into it. Thornley lays bare the opposite in his prefatory letter and in the translation itself. Within the text, the old shepherd Philetus, who first informs Daphnis and Chloe that they are in love, is but one rightly suspicious reader of their innocence in the romance, instructing them that there is no medicine for love, neither meat nor drink nor any charm, but only kissing and embracing and lying naked together. Sorry, I lost my place. For that was not only an enterprise, lying naked together. Philetus initiates a scene in which common innocence is also titillating foreplay. The young lovers take Philetus at his word and attempt the remedies of kissing and embracing with a bold, impatient fury. But they durst not make experiment of lying naked together, for that was not only an enterprise too bold for maids, but too high for young goatherds. Despite their ostensible ignorance, Daphnis and Chloe's sexual awareness appears in their sweet, erotic, amorous dreams, and what they did not do in the day, that they acted in the night in their dreams, and lay together stark naked, kissing, clipping, twining limbs. What they don't understand, the narrator explains, is penetration, so that when they eventually do attempt to act out their dreams, it is a disappointment, for their ignorance of anatomy makes penetration impossible. Daphnis lay down with her and lay long, but knowing how to do nothing of that he was mad to, lifted Chloe up and endeavored to imitate the goats. But at the first finding a mere frustration there, he sat up and lamented to himself that he was more unskillful than a very tup in the practice of the mystery and the art of love. Fortunately, Daphnis meets with another suspicious reader, a lusty neighbor woman, Lycanium, who takes it upon herself to sexually initiate Daphnis. This is the scene singled out by Thornley in the prefatory epistle as uniquely to the purpose of arousal. When Lycanium, when she saw Daphnis itching to be at her, lifted him up from the reclination on his side, and slipping under, not without art, directed him to her fancy, the place so long desired and sought. In accentuating this pleasure as common to Lycaonium and Chloe through the euphemism fancy, an anatomical meaning that, as far as I can find, is unique to Thornley's translation, Thornley reinscribes the suspicion of innocence with which he prefaced his pastoral. Like the artifice of the pastoral wedding that concludes the romance, pastoral codes permit an eroticization of innocence requiring the complicity of the reader. By allowing that simplicity and sincerity may have been coy performance all along, Thornley highlights the pleasurable malleability of those very categories. Section 2, Surviving Love, 5 Love Letters from a Nun to a Cavalier. The tragic love depicted in the wildly popular Les Lettres Portugaises, translated by Roger Lestrange as 5 Love Letters from a Nun to a Cavalier, would appear to be worlds away from the pastoral play of Daphnis and Chloe. Drawing on Ovid's Heroides and the letters of Eloise and Abelard, 5 Love Letters depicts love's bleak end rather than its hopeful onset. Yet, like Thornley's translations of Longus, 5 Love Letters plays with the relationships between convention and sincerity, innocence and knowledge. As scholars have noted, 5 Love Letters was thematically and stylistically calculated to convey the devastation of unrequited love through the appearance of natural, spontaneous prose. Presented as the real letters of a real nun named Marianne, the 5 Love Letters are instrumental in forging an association between sincere, artless female passion and cynical, manipulative male interest. The same dynamic that David Koenig has lampooned in his description of post-critique's exaggeratedly, this is Koenig's description, exaggeratedly gendered scenario in which, quote, one critic, emphatically masculinized, threatens to overpower a vulnerable text to whose actual content he pays no heed, unless another critic intervenes to rescue it, to attend to it with the modest, patient responsiveness of the perfect mother or nurse, end quote. This gendered logic requires not only the disavowal, but also the pathologization of women's self-interest or aggression, affects which appear unable to coexist with true and virtuous love. 5 Love Letters turns on the voyeuristic pleasure of the unrequitedness that establishes sincerity. Ruth Perry and Warren Chernick have concurred that Marianne's isolation attests to the virtue of her passion, which, unlike the calculated rationality of her libertine cavalier, seeks nothing at all in return, not even a response. This radical fidelity, Peggy Camus argues, is premised on Marianne's delusions. Camus describes Marianne as more a hysterical voice than a character, writing letters punctured only by the silence of her lover. Though these readings characterize Marianne's professions of passion quite differently, they share a belief that the very act of writing to someone who does not write back attests to Marianne's sincerity and attachment. I want to suggest, however, that the trajectory of the letters implies that Marianne may be as calculated as her addressee. To be sure, Marianne's letters begin by lamenting her unfaithful cavalier's absence, a word that, along with gone, appears multiple times in the opening of the first letter. And she complains in the second, third, and fourth letters that he has not yet written. The fourth letter contrasts her continued epistolary activity with the cavalier's lack of response, confessing that, "'Tis not so much for your sake that I write, as my own, for my business is only to divert and entertain myself. Beside, that the very length of this letter will make you afraid on it, and you never read it through neither." Yet Marianne's isolation is not entire, nor is her devotion endless. Indeed, her first and last letters are themselves framed as responses to the Cavalier's own missives. Early in the first letter, Marianne complains that, "Your last letter gave me such a passion of the heart, as if it would have forced its way through my breast and followed you. It laid me 3 hours senseless." At this point, her attachment is premised on hope. "You may save yourself the trouble." I don't have that quote on there, sorry. "You may save yourself the trouble, too, of desiring me to think of you. Why, 'tis impossible for me to forget you, and I must not forget the hope that you gave me neither, for your return and of spending some part of your time here with us in Portugal." Marianne's despair in the fourth letter notwithstanding, the fifth letter makes clear that the Cavalier reads and responds to her previous epistles. His cold politeness here extinguishes her optimism, and with it, Marianne's continued love. She runs out of patience, which, as the shared etymology suggests, is also to run out of passion. "By the impertinent professions and the most ridiculous civilities of your last letter," she writes, "I find that all mine are come to your hand, and that you have read them over too, but are as unconcerned as if you forsooth had no interest at all in the matter. Sought that I am, to lie thus at the mercy of an insensible and ungrateful creature, and to be as much afflicted now at the certainty of the arrival of those papers as I was before for fear of their miscarriage. What have I to do with your telling me the truth of things? Who desired to know it? Or the sincerity you talk of, a thing you never practiced toward me but to my mischief? Why could you not let me alone in my ignorance? Who bade you to write? Miserable woman that I am, methinks after so much pains already taken already to delude me to my ruin, you might have strained 1 point more in this extremity to deceive me to my advantage, without pretending to excuse yourself." The litany of rhetorical questions following the quotation of the Cavalier's letter belies Marianne's performance in the first 4 letters of the self-sacrificing love whose passion is proven sincere and selfless to the extent that it is not requited. Her previous assertions, "I'll rather endure anything than forget you," from the first letter, "My love does not depend upon your manner of treating me," from the second, "I would rather choose to love you in any state of misery than agree to bear suppositions that I had never seen you," in the fourth, "And most dramatically, should I survive this restlessness of thought to leave a life of more tranquility and ease, such an emptiness and such an inability could never consist." These professions of fidelity, it turns out, engaged in a protracted delusion, not about the Cavalier, whom she asks to continue lying to her, but about the nature of Marianne's own devotion. Now that she has received the truth, the assurance that the Cavalier will not return, Marianne acknowledges the limits of a passion that she had heretofore represented to herself and to her lover as boundless. The different air and style of the fifth letter indicates that Marianne's love is in fact both finite and relational. The 5 love letters are not to be read as mere apostrophe to an unresponsive object, but as dialogue, even negotiation between 2 persons whose interests diverge, but only one of whose words we can access. My point here is not to defend the Cavalier on the grounds that we don't get his side. I assume he's as caddish as Marianne says he is. Rather, I'm interested in how methods that counsel, as Heather Love summarizes them, reading what texts do say rather than what they don't or can't, relies on a distinction between what is there and what is not that can itself be mystifying. A case in point is Marianne's final letter declaring that, "I am now at length perfectly convinced that since I have irrecoverably lost your love, I can no longer justify my own." Unless we read Marianne as either deceitful or truly mad, we have to accept that the Cavalier's letters are an actual presence in the text, existing in the blank spaces on the page that separate Marianne's dispatches from one another. And it is what those unprinted but not unreal letters say, Marianne avers, that have brought me to myself again. Your last 2 letters, she writes, I am resolved to keep, and to read them over oftener than ever I did in any of the former, for fear of a relapse, thereby fortifying her resolve that I shall not write to you again for all this. For what necessity is there that I must be telling of you at every turn, that I must be telling you at every turn how my pulse beats? The fiction that the 5 love letters are real here, like those of epistolary writing more broadly, conspicuously demands methods of reading that recognize that the common sense distinction between what texts say and what they don't or can't, the objective surface we can describe and the subjective implications that we project, is itself determined by a reader's own interests. Surface, we must remember, is itself a figure for the empirically true, and in literary as well as political discourse, articulating this truth is an act of poesis, of making, rather than description or documentation of what is already there. Section 3, Passion and Prudence, Love Letters from a Nobleman to His Sister. The presumption that virtue inheres in loving a bad object bespeaks a distinctly gendered morality that is even more legible in responses to Aphra Behn's love letters from a nobleman to his sister. In this sense, Behn's love letters picks up where the Lettres Portugaises end, with the aftermath of the decision to survive the end of love. Behn's love letters explore the complex negotiation of love and interest, devotion and self-preservation, that is the subtext of L'Estrange's 5 love letters. A fictionalized version of the scandalous elopement of the Whig Ford, Lord Grey of Werke, with his sister-in-law, Lady Henrietta Berkeley. There's a picture of them. The first part of the love letters advertises itself as a roman à clef that will provide the details not available in the transcripts that had been published shortly after Grey's trial. And here's the allegorized characters that you can look at to help follow along. Advertises itself as a roman à clef that will provide the details not available in the transcripts that had been published shortly after Grey's trial for abduction in November of 1682. Transcripts which would be published together with the 7th edition of Behn's fictional verse in 1765. The second and third parts of Behn's love letter narrate the secret amorous history in tandem with the rebellion and fall of the Duke of Monmouth. Yet the truth that the love letters reveals is the inaccessibility of its characters' motives, even to themselves, along with the impossibility of the pure, selfless virtue that will characterize later fictional heroines in the 18th century. In this, the paranoid reading required by Behn's love letters is the most realistic thing about the text. As Roz Ballister puts it, the experience of conflicting interpretation, ambiguous reference, and slippage of meaning is one that is inscribed into Behn's novel itself, and is in fact structural to its understanding of the necessarily fallen nature of political and sexual life. The 2 main characters, Philander and Sylvia, are typically read as the novel's villains, instrumentaling love as they do to get what they want. Their later lovers, Octavia and Callista, are typically seen as the virtuous brother-sister pair to offset Philander and Sylvia's viciousness. The critical outrage at Philander, and especially at Sylvia, has the effect not only of obscuring the ethical ambiguity of Octavio and Callista, but also of supporting an ideal of female self-sacrifice that naturalizes the commodification and sexual violation of women. At the same time, the one mutually constant and passionate union that Ben depicts, that between Cesario, a figure for the Duke of Monmouth, and Hermione, a figure for Lady Henrietta Wentworth, proves mutually self-destructive. When Philander affirms that self-preservation is the first principle to nature, and when the narrator declares that Sylvia was not of a nature to die for love, they summarize the romance as a whole. Ben's love letters ultimately offer the same lesson that Marianne learns in the 5 love letters when Marianne confesses, "And yet I live, false as I am, and take as much pains to preserve my life as to lose it. If I had loved you," that is the Cavalier, "so much as I have told you 1,000 times I did, I had been in my grave long ere this." The manipulations and deceits that drive the plot of Ben's love letters are almost never simple or straightforward substitutions of fiction for truth, performance for confession. The real motives and desires of the individual characters are consistently obscure not only to those they dupe and betray, but to themselves as well. Rather than offer what McKeon deems the disclosure of inner truths, Ben's supplementation of first-person epistolary writing with third-person narration in the latter parts of the love letters only accentuates the elusiveness of certain knowledge. Private thought is no more transparent than the public rhetoric of letters. To be sure, the extremity of the lovers repeated, one might say repetitive, the novel is the 3 novels together are hundreds and hundreds of pages long, professions of conflicted passions is, as Tony Bowers argues, at least in part rhetorical. But these professions are not always simply for show, at least within the fiction itself. Philander and Sylvia enact the same hackneyed conventions that when they are all alone and have nobody to convince but themselves, as they do in letters to one another. Playing a role, that is, does not necessarily mean that one does not believe in it or want to believe in it. Octavia's final letter to Sylvia comes to a conclusion that might well apply to all of the characters in the romance, including himself. "But oh," he writes, "in vain I seek for reason from thee. Perhaps thy own fantastic fickle humor cannot inform thee why thou hast betrayed me." Betrayal in Ben's love letters is almost never only a matter of premeditated choice. It is the result of characters driven by fantastic fickle humor that leads them not only to betray the trust of others, but also, as often as not, to injure themselves. Sylvia's protracted affairs with Philander, Octavia, and Briard, and I'll put those characters back just for a second, are the most striking instances of the opacity of motive that informs the love letters. Her initial decision to run away with Philander, who is married to her sister, and to marry his servant Briard in order to avoid being returned to her father, in fact attests to the sincerity of her love. However melodramatically she expresses it, Sylvia does not, in fact, choose Philander over her fame and honor, her friends, her parents, and all her beauty's hopes for thee. Sylvia's real material vulnerability appears in the romance's intermittent reports of the money that Philander sends her, as well as her later financial dependence on Octavio, Briard, and the Spanish Alonso. Likewise, Sylvia's effective response to Octavio is repeatedly described as not fully within her own control. However much she manipulates her responses to him in order to gain money, protection, or revenge, the narrator informs us that in spite of all her tenderness for Philander, Sylvia found a soft emotion in her soul, a kind of pleasure at Octavio's approach, which made her blush with some kind of anger at her own easiness, and that she had more inclination than yet she had leisure to perceive for Octavio. In the romance's third part, Sylvia rapidly oscillates between Philander and Octavio because she could not endure to think of losing either. Her deep attachment to Philander, as well as her vanity, lead her to act counter to her own self-interest, which would be to remain with the besotted and faithful Octavio, whom she has also come to prefer. Now she fancies she found Philander duller in her arms than Octavio. Out of mere pride, Sylvia puts herself entirely in Philander's control, knowing that she is hasting to ruin, but ashamed to own the contrary of the devotion she has just professed. Philander immediately confines her in a house in Cleves and forbids her contact with anyone but grave ladies and inhabitants of monasteries. Sylvia regrets extremely her conduct, as she every day saw what she had decayed, her jewels sold one by one, and at last her necessaries by Philander, as, true to his name, he makes 100 little intrigues and gallantries with all the pretty women. Sylvia's odd obedience to Philander attests that truth and fiction, pragmatism and passion are not opposites, but intermingled. The impossibility of separating these motives appears more explicitly in the description of Sylvia's conflicted reaction when Octavio takes holy orders. And I've provided the full quotation on the screen, though I'm not going to read it all. Puncturing the ideal that perfect love, soft, irresistible love, cannot exist alongside prudence and interest, Ben lets us know now, this is nearly 400 pages into the romance, that Sylvia had refused to give herself up entirely, even to Philander, although he aroused the highest flights and passions of her love. Attraction, desire, and passion are not separate from self-interest, and Sylvia's prudence, her determination to shun a life of poverty, does not so much distinguish her from the more seemingly sincere heroines like Chloe and Marianne, as suggests the limits of a romance ideal of selfless, disinterested love. And this ideal, here as in Thornley's preamble to Daphnis and Chloe, disproportionately disciplines women. While scholars have seen Philander as a cad at best and a serial rapist at worst, they have been even more scathing in their descriptions of Sylvia as a sexual predator, an unvarnished prostitute, a corrupt and tarnished libertine mechanically pursuing every empty conquests which give no pleasure. Critics are fond of quoting the romance's final description of Sylvia's fate, in which, having ruined the fortune of that young nobleman, Alonso, she is expelled from Flanders by his uncle, the governor, and forced to remove for new prey, and daily makes considerable conquests. But this overlooks Alonso's own predatory past, one that includes a seduction contest with Philander, which that young nobleman himself describes in gleeful detail. It also ignores Sylvia's own genuine attraction to Alonso, the 1,000 agitations and wishes so intense that she durst no longer trust herself abed with him, in a homoeroticized scene in which, disguised as a boy, she is lodged together in a bed with Alonso. Indeed, even the most seemingly virtuous characters in Ben's novel, Octavio and Callista, act as much from a wise regard to interest as from soft, irresistible love. Octavio, upon learning that Philander intends to seduce his married teenage sister Callista, is willing to allow that to happen if it will help his cause with Sylvia. Octavio's imagination of his sister's seduction verges on gleeful voyeurism. "Well," cried he, "if thou beest lost, Callista, thy ruin has laid a foundation for my happiness, and every triumph Philander makes of thy virtue, it is the more secure my empire over Sylvia. And thou," continued he, "O perjured lover and unconstant friend, glut thy insatiate flame, rifle Callista of every virtue heaven and nature gave her, so I may but revenge it on thy Sylvia." Apostrophizing both Callista and Philander by turns, Octavio encourages a seduction that he knows can only harm his sister. At best, this harm will be emotional, through Philander's all too predictable betrayal. At worst, it will be fatal, through the violence of her cuckolded husband, Clarinao, who we later learn had killed his first wife, for which he was obliged to fly from the court and country of Spain. Octavio's choice to put Callista at risk, not incidentally to cheer on a betrayal that will cause Sylvia pain, represents his passion as interest, the willingness to sacrifice not just everything, but everyone to his desire. For even as he urges Philander to glut thy insatiate flame, he understands his own union with Sylvia as a reciprocal act of ruthless vengeance and imperial conquest. Callista's response to her own miserable marriage equally brings together passionate love with self-preservative prudence. Critics have made much of the ambiguity of rape and seduction in Philander's initial relations with Sylvia and Callista. But perhaps because the forced May-December marriage is such a stock motif, perhaps because of an abiding assumption that sex within marriage cannot be rape, they have let pass without comment the scenes of unambiguous and repeated non-consensual sex to which Clarinao subjects Callista. Philander learns from Clarinao's page that he had been married to Callista very much against her consent. Philander receives this information just before he witnesses Clarinao, quote, fall upon her neck, her lovely snowy neck, and loll and kiss and hang his tawny withered arms on her fair shoulders and press his nauseous load upon Callista's body. Callista later tells Philander that he, Clarinao, had ever used to let her have 4 nights in the week her own, wherein he never disturbed her repose. She should have been dead with his nasty entertainment. Pregnant with Philander's child, Callista proposes that they flee together, for she vowed if this unlucky force of flying had not happened to her, she had not been longer able to have endured his tyranny and slavery, but had resolved to break her chain and put herself upon any fortune. Confirming her earnestness, she shoots Clarinao without hesitation when he attempts to stop her escape. Like Philander, Sylvia, and Octavio, Callista is at least as motivated by the instinct of self-preservation as the emotion of love. Her flight is itself a last resort, one undertaken because she cannot find a way to pass off Philander's child as Clarinao's. Having conceived the very first night of her affair with Philander, Callista from that point cannot, quote, prevail for one night with the old count, so that her fears and love increased with her growing belly. Until 4 months pregnant and unable to conceal her ongoing infidelity, she asks Philander to take her away. She escapes in order to liberate herself from her husband's tyranny and slavery. Love for Philander is secondary to Callista's self-protection. This mixture of interest and passion appears prominently in the narrative detail that Callista takes the time to, quote, put up all her jewels, of which she had the richest of any lady in all those parts, for in that the old count was over-lavish. Unlike Sylvia, who initially fled her parents' home with nothing but the nightgown on her back, Callista does not impulsively put herself upon any fortune. She more prudently takes her fortune with her. The language of empire and slavery that Ben uses to describe Callista's and Sylvia's violations, and that thereby can be seen to justify Callista's rebellion, also alerts us to the colonial and racial contexts of the ideological separation of passion and interest, sex and money that shape idealizations of love. Callista's comparison of herself to enslaved or conquered persons to be abused and sold at will depends on her state as a white woman who should not be subject to such dehumanizing commodification. This racial subtext appears in the depiction of Clarenau's withered, tawny withered arms on Callista's fair shoulders. Metaphors of imperialism and enslavement achieve rhetorical force, that is, both because they evoke knowledge of the real-life horrors of the vehicle and preserve the distinction between vehicle and tenor. Ben's detailed awareness of the brutality of the slave trade is well known, but less discussed is the prominent role that George Berkeley, first Earl of Berkeley, the father of Henrietta Berkeley, there she is, Henrietta, the real-life model for Sylvia, played in English colonization and slavery. Berkeley was governor of the Levant Company, member of the East Indian and Royal African Companies, and member of the Privy Council's Board of Trade and Foreign Plantations. His anger at his daughter's abduction, therefore, is also anger about a possession about his possession of a daughter on whose legitimate marriage his dynasty depends. Even as we acknowledge with Rita Felsky that context stinks insofar as it can be used to police fields through accusations of irrelevance or anachronism, context is something we cannot do without. Indeed, as Ian Smith has recently argued, post-critical polemics have conspicuously ignored the racial and colonial histories that shape the perspectives of readers and thereby posited an abstract reader whose universality depends on racelessness, which is another name for whiteness. Embodied consciousness, imprinted, constrained, and defined by the institutional imperatives of systemic whiteness, Smith writes, is thereby excluded from the reading equation, with the result that racialized skin color, rooted in the obvious properties of surface matter, is treated as if it is an unimportant or non-existent historical sign, when race, by definition, is a function of interpretation, the symptomatic, culture-specific interpretation of bodily signs, end quote. The racial obfuscation that Smith describes is not incidental. It is structural to the Kleinian theory on which so many readers have based the association of love, redemption, and repair. As Sedgwick observes, among Klein's names for the reparative process is love. But in order to constitute good objects to be loved, for Klein, the psyche must also constitute bad objects on which to visit aggression. Klein explains that, quote, the process of separating hatred from love, a process which affords relief, both because the good person is spared, and is a process that affords relief, both because the good person is spared, and because there is satisfaction in hating someone who is thought to be worthy of it. In Klein's account, this process is inevitably racialized, as she explains. Together, quote, this is a quote from Klein, together with the idealization of certain people goes the hatred against others who are painted in the darkest colors, end quote. I'm hardly the first to have observed the racial dimensions of Klein's theory, which is a surface feature, if you will, of her essay on love, guilt, and reparations. Indeed, as Carolyn Laubender and Patricia Stulka have observed, the paradigmatic subject of repair is white, as are the subject's good objects. And insofar as oscillations between love and hate are largely unconscious, repair names the fantasy, the subject's fantasy, not necessarily the object's needs. Those painted in the darkest colors, as Klein puts it, can be neither subject nor good object of love, only bad objects of a necessary and satisfying hatred. Klein's work thereby depends not on a universal promise of redemptive love, but rather on what David Eng calls colonial object relations, in which, as Eng describes it, reparation names the collective social and psychic processes by which love becomes a naturalized property of the European liberal human subject, so that the reparative process, quote, appears as the differential production of the human through the effective distribution of precarious life, as it constitutes and separates good objects deserving of care and redress from bad objects meriting no consideration at all. Such bad objects haunt the margins of Ben's love letters and permit Callista, as well as Sylvia, to claim the moral authority of victimhood. That is, to insist on a need to be repaired, like that of Marianne in the first love letters, is the prerogative of the white European. Considering Ben's writings alongside Daphnis and Chloe and the 5 love letters reminds us that well before Marx or Jameson, Benjamin or Derrida, Sedgwick or Smith, writers, popular as well as philosophical, were concerned with the relation between the surface we can perceive and the fleeting and fragmentary reality that we can access only indirectly, even as it locates that distinction in a context of gendered and racial violences obscured by ideals of white virtue. To read between the lines and to be attuned to contexts that stink more for some than for others can tell us a lot more about the way we read now. Thank you. Bill, yes.
Can you talk a little about what Thornton's translation does with the Greek Daphnis and Chloe, in the sense that I can see all the things that you're talking about already there, at least in German. That incredible piece of work. Are there ways in which, are you working that really he's making more of it, more clearly than the Greek text does?
I'm not a good person to answer that question just because I don't read Greek. So I can't compare Thornley's translation to the original. What I can say, though, is that Thornley really accentuates and, uses terms like fancy, like placket, that, a flap in front, to really, I would say, make the story contemporary rather than treating it as a high-blown classic. And you can, one interesting point of comparison, again, as someone who doesn't read Greek, and if anyone has read it in Greek, I'd actually love to hear what you would say to Bill's question. But one interesting point of comparison is for Thornley's translation that I think gets at just how deliberatively obscene he's being, is the Loeb translation, which actually leaves a lot of the obscene parts in the Greek. So it kind of so you know something's dirty in that if it's in Greek characters, and that also kind of performs the operations that Thornley's talking about with regards to innocent and knowledge, because anyone who can read the Greek, which in I think the Loeb, I actually have it in a footnote, I think the Loeb translation was at some point in the 1920s. I won't spend time looking for it. I can look it up later. But at it was early 20th century, the Loeb translation, and so at that time particularly, anyone who can read Latin is probably going to be a white upper class educated male. So the translator of the Loeb is kind of preserving that the dirty bits for people who can handle them, and letting the readers who don't read Greek just kind of know that it's like bleeped out.
For the sake of the live stream, you've been
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sorry about that. I have such a habit from teaching of not being behind the podium.
This is the question microphone for the live streamers, but you could also use to just wander and speak. But,
It's okay. I'll make myself stay put.
I'm very self-conscious about this surveillance now that I feel like my voice is, maybe they can see the back of my head.
Everyone's watching.
But first of all, thank you. That was extraordinarily complex and enlightening. And I'm going to ask a question partly about method, because I think this is a methodological paper, and you really hit on a point at the end that I think touched on where I was heading. So I'll get there in a second. But I wanted to share a phrase that may be somewhat anathema, certainly outdated, but I kept finding myself asking whether you're offering an allegory of reading as the paper was going. And that brought me also to the question of the relationship, to put another binary that seems fixed in play, the relationship between history and deconstruction. Mm-hmm. And it really struck me at the end of your paper, you offered with this wonderful kind of gesture that goes beyond deconstruction, but the ways in which Renaissance texts can be seen to anticipate as you say, Marx, Derrida, Klein, all these other kinds of thinking. And so to go back to the allegory of reading, part of what I was seeing you doing was demonstrating the ways in which these texts deconstruct themselves, and that they deconstruct the binaries that we bring to them, including paranoid and reparative, and pleasure and suspicion. And so, again, to go back to my question, maybe one way to put this would be, and I'm always, kind of thinking about how and whether there is a kind of deconstructive consciousness that we're seeing in the era. And I think that, especially when you're looking at the epistles, that it seems to be gesturing in that direction, a kind of very conscious awareness, at least of the slipperiness of language. And so maybe to put this as a question is, how and whether you might argue that you are offering an allegory of reading, and if so, where are we now than we were 30 years ago when we were talking about allegories of reading? Is it just that we need to go back to it, or obviously I think you're bringing a lot more to it? And also how and whether that might be unique to texts that talk about sex and eroticism, that there's something about that type of content that in particular activates the kind of deconstructive capabilities that you're kind of tracing out here. So I know it's a lot. I hope that helps.
Yeah, so I hadn't thought about the allegory, this as an allegory of reading. I mean, I do see Thornley's preface and some of Ben's commentaries, which I included less of in this version of the paper, as thematizing or theorizing reading, at least, and the the various operations of consciousness and disavowal and knowledge and ignorance that shape readerly pleasure, right? So that kind of defy the sense that and this is what I'm trying to get at with my title, that defy the sense that paranoia is just grim and angry, and reparative reading is really pleasurable and relaxing. I mean, it's kind of by now, I think, a cliche. Everyone says this, reparative readers are weirdly paranoid about paranoid reading. So, and take a lot of pleasure, I think, in that paranoia. So yeah, but I think I can see how this works, how thinking through these prefatory and narratorial comments might also be a way of historicizing a mode of reading that is, to use a deconstructive term, always already deconstructive, in the sense that Renaissance writers, from rhetoricians to school teachers to literary authors, assumed that language could not quite be closed down in the way, and that texts never can really mean what they say they are. Monarchs never can mean what they say they are, et cetera. Priests sure as hell never mean what they say they do in these readings. And this is, I think, inscribed, you can see it in all manner of literary works, not just here. What I think is interesting about these texts is particularly the epistolary works are kind of setting this up as a fiction of real live letters that were found and printed, even as they really acknowledge that just because we have the real letters doesn't mean we have anything like the real truth about what's happened. Thinking about your other question, does erotica particularly invite that kind of interpretation? One thing that certainly makes me think of is a book that I know a lot of you here know, which is Valerie Trobe's Thinking Sex with the Early Moderns, right? And one of her key arguments there, again, as I think many of you are aware, is that these moments of opacity or ignorance where we come up on a phrase like, I forget, she has this hilarious list of examples, but it's like stirring a pot or kettling a fish. Like it's a little bit like the Greek untranslated. We know that it means something, but exactly what it means is we actually can't access that. We can try to find out, but again, even if we had someone say, well, this is what kettling a fish was, here's what you do, right? Even that wouldn't quite get us at the knowledge that figural expression uniquely conveys. So I think that's one of the things I'm trying to think about, and with that I'm trying to think about how, the presumption that one is just reading and that one can, especially in the context of academia, that one can really just read for pleasure and repair, also, rests on particular idealizations of what loving literature would be, that again themselves insist that by making our literary texts into a good object, we can't, we have to not acknowledge the things that make those texts possible. So I gestured towards the end of this paper to this, this wider world in which, the family that Ben is writing about is immediately engaged in all of these ventures of colonialism and the establishment of plantation in the Americas. So yeah, that. Thanks. Yes.
So you mentioned in the, especially in the first section, about the audience and the intention of these works and sort of the conflict between the utility and the actual love of the text. And then later on you talk about how a lot of these texts are deeply patriarchal. I'm curious about, do you think that since a lot of these texts were targeted at women to an extent, obviously there was also a male component of the audience, but do you think that since a lot of these texts were written by men, that they sort of wanted to inform the desires of women at all? with the context of the text?
I mean, I can't say what they wanted to do. I think certainly one effect was to make to make erotica available to women by putting it in these, you know, feminine genres of pastoral and romance. So I'm less, I guess my focus here is less on a liberation of female desire, which I think certainly arguably is part of all of these works. I mean, I think particularly in Ben's love letters, you have a pretty, you know, neutral depiction of women who are not confining themselves to patriarchal expectations of modesty. But what I'm interested in is how those depictions of female sexuality get mediated through expectations of knowledge, interest, innocence, virtue, that I think, you know, to come back to Stephen's question, are also allegories for the way that we read, for both contemporary readers and now.
We have time for one or two more questions. And by the way, there's a reception after that you're all invited to here in the back of the room, just to let everyone know. Here we go.
Hey, Melissa.
Hi, Henry.
Thank you for that very rich paper, and there's so much material in it. And I wanted to just maybe invite you really with a very kind of open question, but it's to kind of restate Stephen's question, which I also really appreciated. Do you have a recommendation for us as to how we should read now? I kind of took that to be partly Stephen's question. In other words, I'm trying to hear in the paper the degree to which you are reparative in your own orientation towards reading. We should do this, we can read this way. There is a value in reading this way. And to what degree you are hesitating to do that, and to what degree you're criticizing how people are reading, including your own colleagues at Penn. You know, there's a sort of a little bit of a push, a gentle push back against some of the terms. So you're balancing between describing how we read now and doing it very elegantly with new materials. But I am genuinely curious, as a very nice reader and thinker, what you think we should be doing.
Oh, wow. So here's what we should do.
Of course, I mean it as open as you want it.
I can really take your question as I
just explain.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And so for me, I think that one of the moves that you know, so much identity-based, I guess, for want of a better term, criticism has made, right? And this could be, you know, critical race and empire studies, critical ethnic studies, queer studies, feminist studies, trans studies. You know, one could think about, you know, lots of forms of this, but one of the moves that has been made for quite a while now, you know, going back to the 80s and 90s, is to think about how you know, there is no such thing as a text that's just there waiting for us to read it. And I think this is a little bit of what I was talking about too in the article that Marjorie quoted at the beginning, right? Where, oh, sorry, I'm walking away, where we are, you know, in our world and our attunement to the various injustices that we face, which all have, you know, very long histories, and an awareness that, you know, for instance, you know, you could take readings of race, right? So, and this is Smith's argument, the notion that racism is just an intentional animus of bad people, as opposed to an entire, see, I knew I would do it. Luckily, there was a lid. An entire structure that conditions the possibilities in the world. That reading itself depends on, insisting that formal equality before the law, for instance, is actually descriptive of the world, right? And, so recent, attention to things like microaggressions is paranoid reading. And I mean paranoid in not a bad sense. I think often of a comment that Arthur Little makes at the beginning of Shakespeare Jungle Fever, where he, writes that he's sometimes accused of being paranoid about race, and then he says, I think, as a black man teaching in a largely white field, being paranoid is a necessity. So thinking about that trajectory of reading, and also thinking about questions that scholars, I'm thinking here of Sian Nai or Patricia Stolka, have raised about the particular timing when the reparative modes started to emerge. The reading that they both offer is that as, racial capitalism kind of naturalizes itself, there's a turn to reparative modes of reading that comes out of a certain despair with the activism of the 70s, and kind of thinks, well, if, I can't make the world better, it's all just right there and messed up, but I can make myself feel better. So this is a really roundabout way of getting to your question, what do I think we should do? And, I guess I would say that I think that we should not do anything new, but continue along the paths that have been laid out for us by scholars who have taught us to think about the ways in which literary texts participate in the worlds that inform them. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you just cancel a text, right? You don't read it because it does bad things, but it does mean, in fact, the very value to reading some texts might be that they allow us to diagnose these long-standing structures. And the pleasures that can be had from them. And that's the other piece is, recognizing that as readers, we also can't get outside of it. Like we are what Michael Rothberg calls implicated subjects. And so trying to think within a structure that we are also part of is one of the challenges of reading. And I don't think there's not a way out of that, but I think there are ways to attempt to become more aware of it and to constantly reassess the processes that we have as new information lets us see new things. It's, well, if you want to call it that, yes. It's a woke reading, but it's not a woke reading in the sense of, like the denunciation of those who aren't woke. It's much more a reading that relies, that relies on as much critique of the self, I guess I would say, as critique of what other people have missed are doing. So, yeah.
Terrific. Thank you, Melissa, so much for the
Thank you,
talk
everyone.
and the conversation. And let's thank her with our hands.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Please join us for more.